Gao Yang was continuously thrown up by the turbulence and then yanked back to his seat by the seatbelt. Looking out the airplane window, he could only see persistent lightning, and the only sounds were the pouring rain battering against the aircraft and thunder. The fact that he was on a plane that was at least 20 years old and seemingly falling apart made Gao Yang regret his decision to come to Africa for the first time. A dilapidated plane amidst deadly weather had Gao Yang, a 23-year-old, thinking his life might end here. Surprisingly, he wasn't really panicking but trying to figure out exactly where he was, or rather, above which location. He felt that even if he were to die, he should at least know where it was happening. Gao Yang turned to ask the guide beside him if he knew their current location but immediately dismissed the thought. The guide beside him was desperately drawing crosses on his chest and praying loudly. Gao Yang decided it was best not to disturb him. The small 20-seat cabin was already in chaos. Everyone was in a state of frenzy, and the two hunting company employees who had been consoling everyone at the beginning were now crying louder than the rest. At this point, Gao Yang was the calmest person in the cabin, but his calm didn't last long. Fear, despair, and regret came all at once, especially when he thought of his parents, and he couldn't help but burst into uncontrollable weeping. What Gao Yang feared the most now was not the impending death, but the unbearable pain that his parents would suffer from losing him. As death approached, time seemed to pass extremely slowly, long enough for one to reminisce over their entire life. Gao Yang was personally validating this notion as scenes from his 23 years of life flashed through his mind like a film. While Gao Yang was immersed in regret and remembering his life, the altitude of the plane decreased further, and finally, after a massive jolt, the aircraft plunged downwards. When the cabin lights went out abruptly, Gao Yang curled up tightly, his hands behind his head. After a terrible crash, Gao Yang violently hit the seat in front of him, dizzy from the impact. While his shoulders and abdomen were almost torn apart by the seatbelt, it almost knocked the breath out of him. Gao Yang had his eyes closed, but the coldness that engulfed him immediately after the intense pain made him realize he was in water. Instinctively holding his breath, Gao Yang, after a moment, realized he wasn't dead. The plane had plunged into the water, and he needed to leave the aircraft immediately and get to the surface. Opening his eyes in the darkness, he could barely make out his surroundings using the flashes of lightning. The plane had broken in two, and the breach was right above Gao Yang. His first instinct was to unbuckle his seatbelt, but he couldn't find the latch. As time ticked away, and he was about to run out of air, he remembered the hunting knife hanging from the waist of his guide. Gao Yang reached out his left hand and touched the guide's arm. After feeling down for a moment, he found the handle of the knife. Pulling the knife out, he cut the strap holding him down. Suppressing the urge to surface immediately, he reached out to cut the guide's seatbelt. But as soon as Gao Yang touched what remained of the guide's head, he immediately abandoned the thought of rescue. He reached under his seat, grabbed the life jacket, pushed off with his feet, and surfaced. Upon reaching the surface and taking a deep breath, Gao Yang immediately put on the life jacket. Once he felt it inflating rapidly after tugging the rope, he finally exhaled a sigh of relief. Nobody would have expected that a plane flying over land would end up crashing into water, resulting in nobody on the plane wearing a life jacket. Feeling fortunate that he remembered to grab the life jacket in the end and grateful that it was undamaged, Gao Yang was somewhat perplexed about what to do next. The water's surface was still stormy, dark as night even during the daytime. Combined with the splash from the heavy rain, it was impossible to see where the shore was, leaving Gao Yang clueless as to where he should swim towards. Panicking, he started swimming in a random direction but soon realized that every time he kicked, his right knee throbbed with excruciating pain, and he didn't have the strength to swim, even with the buoyancy of the life jacket. Helpless, Gao Yang stopped trying to reach the shore and decided to float and rest on the water's surface until he noticed that he was being pushed by a rapid current. The flowing water meant that they were in a river, not a lake. Relieved, Gao Yang thought that if he could rest a bit and then drift downstream while angling toward the bank, he should be able to reach the shore with a bit of effort. Realizing that he still held the knife in his hand, he was unwilling to discard such a crucial tool in the wild. After a moment's hesitation, Gao Yang risked being cut by the sharp blade and tucked the knife into his waistband, tightening it firmly thereafter. All that was left for Gao Yang was to rest a bit before trying to reach the shore, but before he could rest long, he heard an ominous rumbling noise. Gao Yang stretched his neck to look and was horrified to see a large patch of mist appearing not far ahead. The presence of mist indicated that the mist was either a waterfall or a rapids, both of which would be deadly for Gao Yang at that moment. After cursing bitterly, Gao Yang desperately paddled, trying to get to shore before the danger arrived, but his current strength was no match for the increasingly rapid river. Eventually, Gao Yang was swept over a waterfall. Fortunately, it wasn't very high, and all he did was gulp some water before blacking out. He didn't know how long he was unconscious, but when he eventually opened his eyes, the pain all over his body and the overwhelming weakness made him feel life was worse than death. When Gao Yang's consciousness cleared slightly, he realized that he was less than 4 or 5 meters from the riverbank, and it was gently sloped, easy to climb onto. Crucially, he could feel the soft mud of the riverbed under his feet. Driven by the instinct to survive, Gao Yang, mustering strength from who knows where, crawled using his hands and feet until he reached the riverbank. He rested there for at least half an hour before he finally made it entirely ashore. Once he was completely on land, he was so exhausted he felt like a blob of mud. But crucially, he was not just tired, he was also very hungry, extremely so. Gao Yang realized that although he had miraculously survived the plane crash, the danger was far from over. This was Africa, and it was all too common for someone to be eaten by wild animals without ever making the news. Observing his surroundings, Gao Yang found himself in a typical savanna, an endless sea of grass dotted with tall trees. The sun was close to the horizon, but Gao Yang couldn't distinguish the direction and therefore couldn't tell if it was morning or afternoon. After a brief inspection, Gao Yang tried to move his body and found that his condition wasn't as bad as he imagined. Although his right knee still hurt, the bone was intact. It was likely just bruised. Aside from the ache everywhere, there were no serious injuries. Without serious injuries, things were much easier. After a long sigh of relief, Gao Yang began checking the items on him. As a military enthusiast and an experienced backpacker, he always had his personal survival kit, PSK, on hand, a habit that came in handy now. The PSK is short for Personal Survival Kits. As a military enthusiast and loyal fan of the Bear Grylls survival show, Gao Yang always carried his PSK pouch on his belt. Despite often being mocked as a lunatic, his persistence was now paying off. Gao Yang's only regret was that his PSK pouch was a bit too small for convenience. Before coming to Africa, he chose very specific items, so everything in the pouch was now crucial. 2 large blocks of chocolate, a fire starter, a compass, a magnifying glass, 10 meters of paracord, 5 fish hooks and 10 meters of fishing line, a survival whistle for condoms, and a medical kit comprised Gao Yang's PSK. There were more items in Gao Yang's PSK, but having to fly, he removed things like knives and lighters which were not allowed on the plane. Luckily, he had obtained a knife from the guide, securing the most critical tool for outdoor survival. High calorie and high energy, the 2 large chocolate bars were what Gao Yang needed most right now. He swallowed the chocolate slowly, moved to tears by the taste. Gao Yang didn't dare to finish all the chocolate. He only ate 1 bar. If he wasn't so starving, he would have only had a few pieces to keep until he found other food. While waiting for his strength to return after eating, Gao Yang, to distract himself and calm his nerves, examined the knife he had taken from the guide. The knife was exquisitely crafted with a handmade feel, about 32 centimeters in length, 5 millimeters thick, a drop-point tip, and a large flat-grind blade. The handguard was made of brass, and the handle appeared to be desert ironwood with an attractive color and grain. The essence of the knife was the perfectly curved burn line on the blade, enhancing its appeal and indicating that it was a carbon steel knife hand-forged, as most stainless steel couldn't produce such a beautiful burn line and production line goods wouldn't bother. The knife was razor-sharp, easily shaving hair. It was clear that its former owner, a South African white man, and the guide, or rather, the professional hunter of Gao Yang's hunting group, had treated this knife with great care. Gao Yang had spoken with him about the knife during the flight, never imagining the knife would end up in his hands. Thinking that he was the only survivor from the entire plane, Gao Yang felt sad but also grateful for his good fortune. When everyone was fighting for seats away from the uncomfortable rear of the plane, Gao Yang chose the relatively safest position at the tail. That choice was the sole reason he survived the crash, aside from sheer luck. Gao Yang shook his head, no longer dwelling on pointless thoughts, and pulled out his compass to check the direction. He realized in shock that the sun was setting in the west, meaning it was afternoon. He had boarded the plane around this time, so he had been unconscious for a whole day and night. He didn't know how far he could drift in the river in a day and night, but the farther from the crash site, the slimmer his chances of rescue. Another pressing issue was the approaching darkness. Thanks to all the wildlife documentaries he had watched, Gao Yang knew how terrifying the nights could be on the African savanna. He could no longer afford to delay. He struggled to stand up, intent on finding shelter or, at the very least, making a fire before dusk set in. There were many dead branches washed ashore by the river, so collecting them was easy. Gao Yang found a long and sturdy stick to use as a crutch, then began collecting as much drywood as he could, preparing for his first night on the African fields. While working, he remained vigilant of his surroundings. There was too much he needed to be wary of, especially during the rainy season, when the grass grew tall and lush, and any sudden appearance of predators could be lethal. Gao Yang decided to camp a little farther away from the river to avoid possible predators coming to drink and to guard against a possible rise in water level. During the rainy season, even if there wasn't local rain, upstream downpours could result in a sudden inundation. The plan was to rest nearby for the night and then look for food in the morning. Although it was difficult to move, he had fishing lines and hooks, which meant fishing was a possibility. If he could get food, Gao Yang could survive for a few days while healing his knee injury and sending out distress signals. Someone might come to his rescue. And even if no one passed by in the next few days, he could make a raft and drift down the river as soon as he was able to move better. He believed there had to be habitation along the river. It was just a matter of distance. Holding a few essential survival items gave Gao Yang increased confidence in staying alive. However, it seemed fate was still challenging him. Just as he dragged a bundle of wood towards the campsite he had chosen with his paracord, he suddenly heard a gunshot. A sudden gunshot startled Gao Yang, and before he had the chance to cry out for help, a burst of intense gunfire followed immediately. Hearing the gunfire like popping beans, Gao Yang turned his head and saw about 500 to 600 meters away, two groups of people exchanging fire. Although it was a little far to see clearly, he was certain this wasn't a hunt. It was a firefight, an actual battle. Gao Yang's heart sank. Without a second thought, he immediately lay down in the bushes. Even at a distance, he didn't want to be hit by a stray bullet or discovered by either party involved in the fight. It was better to stay hidden without knowing who was fighting. All he could hear were fierce gunshots, and his view was obscured by tall grasses. Gao Yang had no intention of standing up to see what was happening. He just prayed he remained unseen. The battle had started suddenly, and the gunfire soon became sporadic, though it did not stop completely. Soon, to Gao Yang's surprise, the gunshots grew closer. Every so often, gunshots sounded, rapidly approaching him. Gao Yang inwardly lamented, adrenalized, he felt dry-mouthed, hair standing on end, and his hands shook uncontrollably. He forced himself to calm down, pulled out the hunting knife from his waist, took a few deep breaths, and carefully raised his head to observe. Two camouflaged men, one after the other, were running towards Gao Yang's hiding spot, with 7 or 8 people chasing them while continuously shooting. Soon the man behind was hit, his chest bursting into a spray of blood before he fell to the ground. The remaining man kept running towards Gao Yang, and to Gao Yang's dismay, he ran faster than a rabbit. Initially, there were several hundred meters between them, but it had not even been a minute since the gunfire started, and now the man was less than 50 meters away, rapidly closing the distance. The fleeing man occasionally fired back in the hope of slowing down his pursuers. As he turned to shoot again, his gun clicked empty. He was out of bullets. A bullet then struck his head precisely, and with a muffled "ft," his brain sprayed into the air. Gao Yang did not need to raise his head from the ground to see everything clearly, because if that man had not died, he would have stepped on him in just 2 more steps. When the last fleeing man fell, a cheer erupted, but at that moment, Gao Yang only felt like crying. He regretted not running away when it all started. If he had fled initially, he might not have drawn the fighters' attention. Now, it was too late to run. The cheer quickly ceased, and then a voice called out,
EGA, go check it out! Everyone else, clean up the battlefield! We need to leave quickly!
The speaker was using English, with a strange accent, but Gao Yang had no trouble understanding. Footsteps approached, and seeing how close the dead man's body was, Gao Yang knew he couldn't remain hidden. After a moment's hesitation, he decided it was better to take the initiative. To avoid misunderstandings, Gao Yang stuck the hunting knife behind his back and, while lying on the ground, shouted in English,
"Don't shoot! I am Chinese. I don't have a gun. I am not a threat. I am a survivor of a plane crash. Please understand clearly. I am Chinese, a survivor of a plane crash. I am not a threat."
Who are you? Come out and raise your hands!
Not immediately being shot at was slightly relieving for Gao Yang.
"I am coming out. Please don't shoot. I am sorry. I am seriously injured. My movements will be slow. Please don't shoot.
Gao Yang slowly stood up while speaking, raised both hands, and remained still. He then saw the nearest black man, about 7 to 8 meters away, with 6 others, closer or farther, scattered around 100 meters from him, all with their guns pointed at him. The man closest to Gao Yang, seeing his face, seemed to relax a bit, convinced that Gao Yang posed no danger. Then someone shouted from a distance.
EGA, who is it?
The man called EGA, holding a rusty AK-47 and dressed in worn camouflage clothes, was surprisingly wearing flip-flops, not looking like any regular soldier. The one named EGA pointed the gun at Gao Yang, ran up to him for a closer look, then slightly tilted his head, shouting back to his companions.
He's a yellow-skinned guy. He says he's Chinese, and he doesn't have a gun.
With hands raised high, Gao Yang put on a forced smile and shouted.
Sir, I've encountered a plane crash, and I'm the only survivor. If you and your friends could help me, I will be very grateful and pay you. Please don't kill me. It would be more beneficial for you to save me.
As he spoke, Gao Yang kept his eyes locked on the gun in EGA's hands. They were practically face-to-face, and the gun was within arm's reach of his head. Gao Yang dreaded that the man called EGA would pull the trigger. When Gao Yang finished speaking, he received no response from EGA. Instead, he heard a voice he desperately did not want to hear say,
Kill him!
Gao Yang felt his heart sink, but EGA did not fire immediately. Instead, he turned his head back and shouted,
He says he can give us a lot of money. Idiot! Kill him!
After hearing, kill him. A second time, Gao Yang hesitated no more. As EGA didn't turn back around, Gao Yang grabbed the gun barrel with his left hand and lifted it upwards, while his right hand pulled out the hunting knife from his waist. Then he lunged forward, tackling EGA to the ground. Pinning EGA beneath him, Gao Yang had the knife out, and in a panic, EGA instinctively pulled the trigger. Gunfire blasted near Gao Yang's ear. The barrel was searing hot from previous shots, and after firing the bullets, it burned even more. Gao Yang, enduring the pain, kept his hold, not letting the gun aim at himself, and then he thrust his hunting knife up from EGA's abdomen. After stabbing the knife all the way in, Gao Yang angled his body and pulled out the knife for another upward thrust, piercing from the abdomen straight to the heart. EGA convulsed once before ceasing to move. It all seemed slow to describe, but the events unfolded rapidly. From Gao Yang's initial attack to the end, it took only 2 to 3 seconds, and only then did the people at a distance begin to react. Gao Yang grabbed the AK-47 and took a deep breath, knelt on one knee, aimed quickly, and fired 2 shots. With each shot, a person fell. Gao Yang fired twice, hitting 2 shadows that fell to the ground with chest wounds, dying instantly. After firing twice, Gao Yang rolled to the ground, not forgetting to pull out his knife from EGA's body, and crawled rapidly to one side. As soon as he moved, bullets landed where he had just fired from, scattering grass and dirt. Gao Yang's sharp shooting startled the enemy. Although they fired fervently, no one dared to rush him. Surprisingly, even Gao Yang himself was shocked by his accuracy, not expecting his marksmanship to remain so precise after years without practice. After crawling over 10 meters, the gunshots ceased. Gao Yang dared not crawl further. He stopped, propped himself up carefully, and peered out to see 4 opponents crouching and slowly approaching. Gao Yang took a deep breath, knelt on one knee, and after 2 more shots rang out, another enemy fell. This time the enemy was cautious, exposing very little. Gao Yang fired 2 shots but only hit one. Killing and seizing the gun, followed by firing quickly, was not something Gao Yang had planned from the start. He still hoped the other party would spare him, even offer help, until they said, "Kill him." Twice in a row. That's when Gao Yang, resolved for a do-or-die struggle, acted. It had all happened so unexpectedly. However, firing the second time was deliberate, though not as effective. Firing revealed his position, so Gao Yang once again lay down and crawled swiftly, ignoring the sound of bullets burrowing into the earth nearby, merely moving forward with his head down. When the gunfire stopped again, Gao Yang ceased crawling, cautiously lifted his head to observe, and saw one of the men peeking over, only exposing a bit of his forehead, looking towards Gao Yang but seemingly not having spotted him. They were about 70 to 80 meters apart, and the enemy did not dare to approach too quickly, which somewhat relieved Gao Yang. He finally had time to check how much ammunition he had left. When the gunfire stopped again, Gao Yang ceased crawling, cautiously lifted his head to observe, and saw one of the men peeking over, only exposing a bit of his forehead. Looking towards Gao Yang, but seemingly not having spotted him. They were about 70 to 80 meters apart, and the enemy did not dare to approach too quickly, which somewhat relieved Gao Yang. He finally had time to check how much ammunition he had left. Gao Yang carefully held the magazine to avoid making noise as he removed it. Once it was out, he couldn't help lamenting internally only one bullet was left in the magazine. Including the one in the chamber, he had a total of 2 bullets, yet there were still 3 enemies. It was clear that they wouldn't be short on ammunition. Knowing he had to find a way to leave the situation, even if he could dispatch 1 enemy per bullet, the remaining man could still kill him. Gao Yang didn't dare to hope he could deal with another using the knife, especially not knowing if the enemy had reinforcements. The only piece of good news was that it was getting dark. He estimated he had about an hour before sunset. If he could hold out until then, he would have a chance to escape. After reinserting the magazine, Gao Yang rose to observe his surroundings. There was no sign of the enemy, but this time, he didn't crawl to the ground. Instead, he kneeled on one knee, staying as concealed as possible while vigilantly scanning the area. It wasn't long before Gao Yang saw a head slowly rise from the grass, looking around before rushing forward a few steps, only to quickly duck back into the cover. A few seconds later, another head emerged from the grass about a dozen meters away, advanced quickly for a few meters, then hid again. The enemy had started to alternate their advance, and the 2 Gao Yang observed were no more than 40 to 50 meters away, dangerously close. He felt he couldn't let them approach unchallenged. Holding his breath, Gao Yang aimed his rifle at the first hiding place he had spotted. The man soon reappeared, though he had shifted 3 to 4 meters from where he first ducked down, moving at a quick pace. Gao Yang didn't hesitate to adjust his aim and pull the trigger. Hitting a moving target was Gao Yang's strength. A shot was fired, and a man was killed. Gao Yang used his 5th bullet to take down the 4th man. This prompted a crazy spray of gunfire in return, but the shooter didn't dare show himself, making the blind shooting not much of a threat to Gao Yang. After moving a short distance, Gao Yang stopped again, still highly alert, watching for any movement from the remaining 2. His last shot had a deterrent effect. The enemy was too scared to advance and lay still in the grass. The standoff continued between Gao Yang and the remaining 2 enemies. Neither side dared to make the first move. Now, fear wasn't only gnawing at Gao Yang, though he only had 1 bullet left. The enemy didn't know this. Gao Yang feared they might rush him together, while they feared exposing their heads would draw a fatal shot. It was a stalemate with both sides frightened. Time passed by the second, and the sky gradually darkened. Gao Yang's chance of survival was increasing, and the remaining enemies remained motionless. At this point, Gao Yang was contemplating which direction to flee. About 100 meters to the east of Gao Yang was a river, while the remaining 2 enemies were to the west-northwest. He had 2 options for escape: head south or head south first and then move along the river post-escape. Gao Yang planned to go south and then head to the river, mainly because his injured right knee made it difficult to move, but he would be more mobile in water. Once fully dark and visibility waned, Gao Yang prepared to move, but just then, he realized a grave mistake. He had been wearing a life jacket, which, while conspicuously orange, was paramount for escape through the river, as it would provide buoyancy. Despite being a swimmer, without the life jacket, he stood no chance in his hungry and injured state. The jacket's bright color wasn't an issue in the daylight with the cover of grass, but now, as night fell, Gao Yang was shocked to discover that the jacket emitted a soft glow intense enough to be seen from a distance, which would be even more noticeable in water. Gao Yang was bemused. He quickly took off the life jacket and tried to remove the glowing strips, but realized it would deflate the jacket if he did. Just then, he heard rustling noises. Knowing he couldn't delay, he regretfully set the jacket aside and began crawling slowly southward. Patiently, Gao Yang crawled, aware that his opponents couldn't see him as long as he didn't make too much noise. After covering a considerable distance, he heard a burst of gunfire from behind. He suspected the enemy had found his life jacket. Realizing they hadn't given up the chase, Gao Yang slightly quickened his crawling. Yet suddenly, an idea struck him. Perhaps he should try to divert his pursuers. After hesitating, he began moving toward the riverbank, pausing after short intervals to listen for any pursuit. When he was around 20 meters from the bank, he stopped. He no longer had grass cover. Gao Yang didn't want to risk leaving cover. A little noise in the water would be enough. Lamentably, he hadn't encountered a stone, and there was nothing around to make use of. After a moment's thought, Gao Yang quietly unloaded the magazine and tossed it into the river. The last bullet was already chambered, making the empty magazine useless. The gunfire had scared away all the wildlife, and now the plane was silent, making the splash of the magazine very audible. Regardless of the outcome, Gao Yang no longer stayed put but crawled towards the depths of the plane. When he felt he was far enough and too exhausted to continue, he finally rested on the ground. Hunger gnawed at him. He had no strength left. By his estimate, he had crawled at least 300 to 400 meters. What Gao Yang needed most was energy, not time to be frugal. Reluctantly, he took out the remaining piece of chocolate, slowly opened the wrapper, and swallowed it down. With sustenance, he felt better and the chocolate's energy would help him persist. After catching his breath and feeling a bit stronger, he checked behind him, seeing nothing but darkness. Decisively, he stood and started moving south. Whilst his right knee still hurt, he could persist, but he was inevitably slower. Gao Yang couldn't afford to stop. He had to keep going. He had no idea how long he walked, just that it was a very long time. His rest intervals grew. Almost every 5 minutes of walking required 15 minutes or longer to recover. He was thirsty, hungry, and at his limit. If not for his determination to get home, he would have already collapsed. The moon had risen, thankfully not full, only offering dim light, preventing any pursuers from making out his trail. Judging by the moon's position, Gao Yang surmised it was around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Unable to continue, he decided to stop. Leaning against a large tree, Gao Yang sat down. After moving so far from the battlefield, the wails of wild animals echoed incessantly, and some sounded close. Although unable to discern the calls, Gao Yang knew Africa's formidable creatures, lions, leopards, and hyenas, were nocturnal, with hyenas mainly active at night. That he hadn't encountered any predatory animals was fortunate, though for all he knew, they might have been nearby without him realizing. But more worrisome than predators were the swarms of mosquitoes and other insects that not only left welts but also carried diseases like malaria. Fortunately, Gao Yang had prepared well for the African environment, and his medical kit, though small, surely contained insect repellent. After using some repellent, tiredness took over. Clutching the rifle with its last bullet, Gao Yang quickly fell asleep. In his sleep, Gao Yang vaguely heard eerie laughter, strange and shrill, drifting near and far around him. He hovered between sleep and wakefulness, able to hear the laughter close by, but extreme fatigue kept him from caring. For some reason, when the laughter stopped, Gao Yang felt a pang of fear and suddenly awoke. Many people have had the experience of being jolted awake from a deep sleep as if startled by something, even if nothing actually happened. So it was with Gao Yang, but when he snapped to awareness, he was stunned to find 4 or 5 pairs of eyes glowing green in the darkness, staring right at him. Just in front of him stood a hyena. As Gao Yang awoke, he first thought he was caught in a nightmare. However, a moment's daze gave way to the chilling realization that he was alone on the African savanna, and what stood in front of him was a very real group of at least a dozen hyenas. The stench was unbearable, and the closest hyena was face to face with him, its jaws capable of reaching his throat with a single snap. Nearly petrified with fear, running on pure instinct, Gao Yang swung the gun and pulled the trigger on the hyena in front of him. A loud bang resounded as the animal fell to the ground, and hearing the shot, the rest of the pack scattered in panic. Frantic, Gao Yang stood up. His heart pounding, he took a while to catch his breath. Only after some time did his frayed nerves begin to settle. The shot hyena had a bullet wound right between its eyes. It couldn't be deader. Gao Yang poked the animal's body with the gun to make sure it wouldn't get up again, then collapsed back onto the ground. He knew that any nearby wildlife had likely been scared off by the gunfire, but the thought of almost becoming hyena's sustenance sent shivers down his spine. Though unsure if hyenas hunted the living, Gao Yang knew they never passed up a carcass. Perhaps they mistook him for dead and targeted him. Given that a hyena's bite can overpower even a lion's, had Gao Yang not woken up, he might have indeed become an actual corpse. Slumped next to the dead hyena, clutching the now bulletless AK-47 tightly, Gao Yang thought about his experiences over the past couple of days, and tears streamed down uncontrollably. Touching the gun in his hands, Gao Yang was overwhelmed with emotion. The root cause of his current predicament was the very gun he held. Gao Yang had come to Africa just to play with real guns. Born in the provincial capital of Hebei province to parents who ran a small factory, he grew up comfortably well off and doted upon. In middle school, his father took him to a shooting range before gun control was stringent, and it was there that Gao Yang first displayed his shooting talent. Shooting a 100-meter target with a Type 56 semi-automatic rifle, Gao Yang missed the center only on the first shot. The rest hit the 8 or 9 rings, a mark of innate skill, impressive for a first-timer, considering even experienced soldiers may not achieve such scores. His results astounded the range staff. Coincidentally, it was a shooting training base in Hebei province, which also served the public to make revenue. Staff there were knowledgeable, and an excited Gao Yang soon lured over a professional shooting coach. After watching Gao Yang shoot a few times, the coach had him try at 200 meters. Gao Yang, unfazed by the distance and aiming as usual, kept his shots near the bullseye. The coach saw his potential as a shooting prodigy and immediately discussed with Gao Yang's father about him training as a marksman. After nagging at home for over a month, and once his parents understood there were academic classes at the sports school as well, Gao Yang finally got his wish. He joined the school and took up shooting. His aptitude for shooting was undeniable, and his dedication to his interest was clear. Within 2 years, Gao Yang swiftly became the youngest member of the Hebei province shooting team. However, despite being in the team, Gao Yang had no chance to compete as slots were fiercely contested by more seasoned members, not to mention representing the country at international levels was out of the question given the plethora of domestic talent. Wishing to compete, a few more years of training would be required, but Gao Yang, being young and impatient, grew tired of the endless routine without a clear path forward and began to consider quitting. His parents had been eager for his return, so at the age of 16, Gao Yang left training and continued his education. 3 years of shooting training inevitably led to him falling behind academically. Not naturally inclined to studious dedication, Gao Yang soon found his second talent, learning foreign languages. English, notoriously challenging for many, seemed relatively easy for him, allowing him to persevere through high school and enter a tertiary institute to study languages. For many, college graduation signifies impending unemployment, but Gao Yang had started part-time work with a trading firm in his freshman year, honed his spoken English, and faced no communication barriers with foreigners. Thus, upon graduation, with his father's help, he started his own trading company. Fortunately, an economic crisis hit just as his business was beginning to gain traction, delivering a massive blow to the entire trading sector. At 23, Gao Yang saw his first business declare bankruptcy. Throughout the year-plus of operation, Gao Yang's enterprise had seen moderate success, earning a tidy sum that set him apart among his peers. However, he'd spent almost all of it on replica guns and famous knives, traveling extensively with a big bag, nonchalantly saving nothing. The company's collapse didn't weigh heavily on him. The very next day after shutting down his business, he gleefully joined an airsoft match. Given the political situation, real guns were out of the question, but for Gao Yang, who had a collection of replicas, he had no interest in laser-based airsoft that felt neither here nor there upon hit. Gao Yang participated in war games, which used replica guns firing BBs, a game seeking to approach realistic combat as closely as possible despite still being a game. He had hoped to vent his frustration with BB pellets, but while playing airsoft was legal, using replicas was not. When Gao Yang and his teammates were caught mid-firing their replicas by the police, they were rounded up. A fine and detention followed. A few days later, he was bailed out by his father, luckily avoiding a lengthier sentence. Back home the day after his release, Gao Yang saw an advertisement online. It was for a hunting trip in Ethiopia, costing 88,000 yuan, with an option to hunt lions for an additional fee. Gao Yang wasn't bloodthirsty, it was more curiosity about hunting. But the allure of wielding real guns on the African plains was too tempting. He'd rather indulge in Africa than play cautiously with replicas. Interests don't change overnight, and Gao Yang was one to act on his impulses. So he sold all his collectibles and savings, pooling 100,000 yuan, just enough for an African adventure. The sum was minimal, allowing only the hunting of common small game, but Gao Yang had no interest in hunting defenseless animals. He saw the trip more as a tour, a chance to handle real guns and view African landscapes. He spent all he had to come to Africa, arriving in Ethiopia, boarding the plane destined for the hunting grounds, or rather, as it turned out, a plane to hell. Next, he found himself in an inexplicable gunfight, resulting in him killing 4 living men and a hyena without ever having taken a life before. Gao Yang had trained with handguns and rifles, but his primary discipline was trap shooting, hence his habit of taking 2 shots, and specifically, at rapidly moving targets. Despite years without touching real firearms, even if the rifle wasn't the shotgun he was familiar with, The habit of 2 successive shots came naturally to him in the crisis. Fortunately, despite the difficulty, the effect had been decidedly effective. Why was he able to handle an AK-47 so comfortably despite never having touched one before? That could be attributed to his collection of replicas and a true military fan's knowledge garnered from the internet and books. He could remember gun diagrams by heart and reassemble most firearms if given the physical component. For something as straightforward as an AK-47, it was a cinch. And his weekly airsoft matches had familiarized him with many tactical maneuvers. To anyone who's played, getting hit by a BB is genuinely painful. To feel more professional and improve the realism during those games, Gao Yang learned countless tactical moves and hand signals from online resources. While what he knew was clearly incomparable to a real elite soldier's skills, it certainly gave him an edge over any untrained combatant who picked up a broken gun to fight as a mercenary or militia. Gao Yang didn't want to regret not experiencing enough when he was young, but now he wished more than anything to be safely at home with his parents. He now truly understood that guns weren't toys. They were weapons designed not for play, but for killing. His wish to play with guns in Africa had been fulfilled, but at a terrible cost. He had only wanted to shoot targets, yet he ended up taking the lives of 4 people. He himself might end up buried in the African savannah, all because he wanted to play with real guns. For the first time, Gao Yang felt that gun control wasn't such a bad idea. Given a choice, he would definitely choose to live in China, where there were no guns for him to play with, but also no fear of being shot at any moment. It's only after you lose something that you realize its true value. Although he had never even dared to kill a chicken, he had now taken the lives of several people. One of them had been in a face-to-face confrontation and killed with a knife. At the time, he hadn't felt much, but now that he had calmed down, he found the memory nauseating and terrifying. Nonetheless, he felt relief that it was them who died, not him. He had killed to protect himself, and he did not regret the consequences of killing those 4 people. An old Western saying summed it up well: better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. However, Gao Yang deeply regretted coming to Africa. All he wanted now was to be able to return home, to be with his parents once more. Thinking of his parents, Gao Yang found new strength to live. He stopped wallowing in self-pity and started thinking about how to survive and get back home. Once he regained his composure, Gao Yang felt it was vital to figure out his location. He thought that Ethiopia was relatively stable and such violent encounters shouldn't be occurring. Struggling to remember, Gao Yang couldn't recall any recent news about instability in Ethiopia before his trip. Naturally, he wondered if he had walked into a tribal feud. If that were the case, he might be okay as long as he could find tourists or ordinary citizens. With no time to waste as dawn approached, Gao Yang could no longer stay put. He feared the gunfire might draw his pursuers. Starving, Gao Yang refused to waste the handiest food source available. Despite the hyena's stinking, scavenger nature, he believed that if he cooked its meat thoroughly, it might be edible. Gao Yang couldn't take the whole carcass with him, nor dare to light a fire there. With no choice, he used his knife to cut off the hyena's 4 legs. Just the act of cutting the legs and seeing his hands covered in blood was intolerable to him. Driven to the brink, people can do the unthinkable. Gao Yang tied the bloody, reeking hyena legs to his body, hacked off a tree branch to use as a crutch, and limped on his way. Taking the AK-47 with him, Gao Yang walked a considerable distance before tossing the gun into a thicket. The gun, without bullets, was nothing but a burden and a danger. He threw it away some distance from where he rested to prevent his hunters from knowing he was unarmed. As the sun rose above the horizon, Gao Yang reckoned he'd covered only about 2 to 3 kilometers, a distance not safe enough. He wanted to keep going, but the thirsty, hungry, and wounded Gao Yang knew he'd already exercised a strong will to have come this far. Gao Yang decided not to move anymore. Until he ate and drank, he wouldn't take another step, fearing he might collapse and never get up again. After noticing a dead, withered tree at a distance, Gao Yang saw a lifeline. In July, the rainy season in Africa, it wasn't easy to find drywood on the savanna suitable for fire. The withered tree could save him a lot of trouble. Slowly making his way to the base of the tree, Gao Yang was initially thrilled, but upon closer inspection, he was at a loss. From afar, the tree didn't look very large. However, standing before it, he found the 7 or 8 meter tall tree had a crown high above, the lowest branches being about 6 meters up, resembling a stretched umbrella, and a thick trunk as wide as his waist. The only way to access branches was to fell the enormous tree, an impossible task with just a hunting knife. Frustrated by the sight of so much potential firewood he couldn't use, Gao Yang sullenly searched the ground and found a few smaller branches that had fallen from the tree. The quantity was meager, but it was enough for him to roast some meat and sate his hunger. As Gao Yang unhappily used his crutch to search and gather branches, he saw something that made his spirits rise. A tree branch as thick as his arm lay in the undergrowth. Gao Yang never imagined being so excited over a broken branch. He eagerly reached out to pick it up, but just as he lifted it off the ground, he felt a sharp pain on his left hand. Feeling the sting, Gao Yang instantly dropped the branch and jumped back. Then he saw a large brown snake coiled on the ground. The snake was thick relative to its length, and the front half of its body rose in an S shape, hissing threateningly at Gao Yang. Inspecting his bitten left hand, he saw 2 puncture marks on the edge of his palm. For a moment, his mind stuttered. He had disregarded the critical, potentially fatal mistake of not turning over stones or rotten wood on the savannah carelessly, for they might hide venomous snakes. How could he have made such a casual yet dangerous error? But clarity soon returned in a bout of fury. With his right hand, Gao Yang swung down his crutch onto the snake, a little behind its head. Once the snake was stunned and on the ground, he pressed its head down with the stick, stepped on it firmly, and chopped off its head with his knife. Believing he wouldn't survive, Gao Yang killed the snake in a fit of anger. However, after decapitating it, he suddenly felt he shouldn't give up just yet. Frantically, Gao Yang pulled out a paracord from his waist pack and tightly wrapped it around his left wrist. He bit one end and tied a knot with his other hand. In just a short time, pain blazed from the wound, blood began to ooze out, and Gao Yang dared not delay. He scrubbed the knife, still bloodied from cutting off the snake's head, against his body and then, with a grimace, sliced deeply at the 2 puncture wounds. The cut was too deep, Gao Yang howled as the knife grazed bone. Shaking from the pain, he made 2 more vertical cuts across the bite marks. As the blood sprayed from his palm, Gao Yang trembled with pain. Watching his hand swell and the bleeding slow, he knew he had to suck the blood out. But sucking poison from a wound can be fatal if the rescuer's gums are bleeding, and Gao Yang had a chronic problem with bleeding gums. Despite his extreme pain, he didn't lose his reasoning. In fact, his mind worked faster than usual, trying to find a way to survive. At this moment, the condoms in his survival pack proved invaluable. Intended for carrying water, they now had another critical use. Gao Yang tore open a condom and put it over his hand. He then placed his hand by his mouth, ready to suck the blood through the latex barrier, preventing any poisoned blood from entering his mouth directly. It was a sorry use for a condom, a tool for pleasure now a means of survival. As Gao Yang put the latex-covered hand to his mouth, a bizarre thought crossed his mind. Damn it, people use condoms for pleasure, and here I am using it to save my life. They use them on others, but look at me, tasting the damn thing myself. Just kill me. Despite his bitterness, Gao Yang sucked hard on the poison. This had some effect, but it wasn't long before no more blood could be drawn from the wound. Looking at his swollen hand, he suddenly remembered a critical detail. If he kept his hand tied off too long, the combination of restricted blood flow and venom could cause the hand to necrotize. Unbinding the paracord was necessary to avoid losing the limb entirely.